On the evening of June 14, 1962, a Boston man named Juris Slessers arrived at his mother's apartment to take her to a memorial service. What he found inside shocked the whole city. His mother, 55-year-old Anna Slessers, lay lifeless on the bathroom floor with a cord cinched around her neck, tied in a peculiar bow. At first, the distraught son thought it might have been a suicide. A tragic mistake, but the truth was far more sinister. Anna had been brutally strangled and sexually assaulted, and her modest apartment on Gainsborough Street had been ransacked. The killer had taken almost nothing of value, yet had left behind a terrifying calling card. The ligature around Anna's neck was her own bathrobe cord, tied in an exaggerated ornamental bow. Welcome to Fridays with Tony. This week I'll be sharing the details of a horrifying crime spree that took place in the early 1960s. Between 1962 and 1964, Boston was gripped by panic. As the body count rose, police warned women not to open their doors to strangers and to secure their homes at all times. In the end, it all went back to a man named Albert DeSalvo. Albert Henry DeSalvo was born on September 3, 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, to a family marked by violence and dysfunction. One of 6 children, Albert endured a childhood of unrelenting abuse at the hands of his father, Frank. Frank DeSalvo was a vicious alcoholic who would beat his wife and children without mercy, sometimes even bringing home prostitutes and having sex with them in front of his family. The horror inside the DeSalvo household left lasting scars. I saw my father knock my mother's teeth out and then break every one of her fingers, Albert later recalled of an incident he witnessed at age 7. On another occasion, Frank sold Albert and 2 of his sisters to a farmer in Maine for just $9, an arrangement that lasted 6 weeks until their frantic mother found and reclaimed them. Young Albert learned to survive through petty crime. He was shoplifting by the age of 6 and soon graduated to more serious misdeeds. In his early teens, DeSalvo was in and out of juvenile reformatories for theft and other offenses. Seeking an escape and a chance at a stable life, he enlisted in the U.S. Army at age 17. Military service took him to Germany, where he proved to be a capable soldier, even becoming the Army's middleweight boxing champion in Europe. While stationed in Germany, he met a local young woman, Irmgard Beck, whom he married before bringing her back to the United States. Together, they had 2 children, a daughter and a son, and for a brief time it seemed Albert DeSalvo might have found a semblance of normalcy. He worked as a factory laborer and handyman to support his family. Neighbors and co-workers found him likable enough, though he was known as an incessant braggart who exaggerated his exploits, a habit that made some doubt his confessions. Still, by outward appearances in the late 1950s, DeSalvo was a devoted family man. Underneath the veneer of ordinary life, however, darker impulses were churning. DeSalvo had an uncommonly high libido, which caused a strain in his marriage. His wife, fearful of having another baby born with disabilities after their first child had serious health issues, often avoided intimacy. By age 29, DeSalvo began acting on disturbing sexual urges that went far beyond the bounds of marriage. In 1960, a peculiar crime spree began in the Cambridge area. A man pretending to be a talent scout for a modeling agency would knock on the doors of young women. If they let him in, he used a measuring tape to take their measurements under the pretext of evaluating them for a modeling career. During these auditions, he groped and molested the women. This odd prowler, described as a muscular man in his late 20s with a friendly demeanor, became known in local newspapers as the Measuring Man. Over a period of months, several women reported this imposter to the police. In March 1960, Cambridge police caught a suspect fleeing from a breaking and entering incident. In custody, the man surprised detectives by freely admitting that he was the infamous Measuring Man. That man was Albert DeSalvo. For the sexual assaults related to the measuring ruse, DeSalvo was sentenced to 18 months in jail. He served 11 months before being released for good behavior in 1961. If authorities hoped that a taste of incarceration had reformed him, they were mistaken. DeSalvo's criminal activities did not stop. In fact, they escalated. Upon release, DeSalvo embarked on a new and more aggressive crime spree that would span several New England states. He took to wearing a workman's green uniform and talking his way into women's apartments, or else breaking in undetected in order to sexually assault them. This prolific serial rapist was referred to by police as the Green Man, due to the green work clothes he often wore during the attacks. Over the next few years, the Green Man struck in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, claiming hundreds of victims. By the time the rampage was over, DeSalvo had confessed to more than 400 home break-ins and upwards of 300 sexual assaults across the region. DeSalvo later bragged that during his peak, he sometimes targeted several women in a single day. It was amid this frenzied period of sexual violence that the Boston Strangler murders began. Crimes far more heinous than anything DeSalvo had been associated with so far. In the summer of 1962, the quiet residential streets of Boston became the hunting grounds for a killer. It started with the chilling murder of Anna Slessers. Only 2 weeks later, another woman was found dead. On June 28, 1962, 85-year-old Mary Mullen was discovered in her home, the apparent victim of a heart attack, or so it initially seemed. It would later be understood that Mary likely collapsed from cardiac arrest in the midst of a home invasion by the same assailant who killed Slessers. The next day, June 30th, the body of 68-year-old nurse Nina Nichols was found in her Brighton apartment. Her residence had been turned upside down as if by a burglar, yet expensive silver pieces were strangely left untouched. Nichols's lifeless body was posed in a degrading manner. She had been strangled with her own stockings, which were left knotted around her neck in a neat bow, and she was partially nude. That very same day, only a few miles north of Boston, in the suburbs of Lynn, a fourth elderly woman was found murdered. Helen Blake, a 65-year-old divorcee, had been strangled in her home, and the brutality inflicted on her shocked even seasoned investigators. Not only had Helen been strangled with a ligature tied in the now familiar bow, but she had also suffered mutilation, with savage lacerations found on her genitals. As with the previous scenes, Helen's home appeared ransacked, yet certain valuables remained, suggesting that theft was not the primary motive. 4 women were dead in a span of just 2.5 weeks. It was now unmistakably clear that a serial killer was stalking Boston. Boston's police commissioner, Edmund McNamara, faced the growing horror head-on. He publicly acknowledged that the city likely had a mad strangler in its midst and took drastic action. All police leave was canceled so that the full force of the department could be dedicated to the case. Detectives swarmed the city, interviewing known sex offenders, ex-convicts, and anyone who might fit the emerging pattern. Women were advised via newspapers, radio, and television to lock their doors and be wary of any stranger who came knocking. Despite this vigilance, the killer was only just getting started. Criminal profiling was a relatively new practice in 1962, but Boston investigators attempted it. The early profile of the murderer theorized that he was likely a psychopath with a hatred for older women, possibly stemming from a bad relationship with his own mother. In retrospect, this guess was chillingly resonant with Albert DeSalvo's own childhood of parental abuse at the hands of his father. However, at the time, the police had little more than educated guesses. They dubbed the unknown murderer the Phantom Fiend, reflecting how he seemed to slip in and out of homes like an apparition, leaving death in his wake. As July turned into August 1962, Boston held its breath. Weeks passed with no new murders. Perhaps the nightmare was over. Those hopes were shattered on August 19, 1962. when the body of 75-year-old widow Ida Erga was found in her apartment in Boston's West End. Ida's crime scene fit the now familiar pattern. No signs of forced entry, suggesting she may have trusted the person who came to the door. She had been strangled and left laid out on her back, clad in a torn nightdress. In a particularly perverse touch, her killer had posed her body with her legs spread apart and resting on two chairs, with a pillow tucked beneath her hips. The staging was as degrading as it was deliberate. Less than 24 hours later, another body was discovered. This time, it was Jane Sullivan, a 65-year-old retired nurse who lived alone in the Dorchester neighborhood. Jane had actually been killed a week prior, but her corpse was only found on August 20th in her bathroom, where she had been strangled with one of her own nylon stockings. 6 murders, all older women, all in their own homes, within a span of about 2 months. The city's sense of security was utterly decimated. Elderly women who had believed themselves safe from violent crime were now as much targets as anyone else. Boston's newspapers blared with headlines about the Strangler. Tips flooded the police department, but none led to a concrete suspect. Unbeknownst to everyone, the Boston Strangler was about to change his pattern in a way that would confuse investigators and raise the public's fear to a new pitch. After the frantic pace of the murders in the summer, there came a lull. For 3 months following the Sullivan case in August 1962, no new similar murders were reported. Boston began to breathe easier as the fall progressed with no incident. Some wondered if the killer had been scared off or even caught for some other crime, or perhaps had died or left town. But in early December, the Strangler struck again, and this time his target was not an elderly woman, but a young and seemingly cautious co-ed. On December 5, 1962, 21-year-old Sophie Clark was found dead in her apartment on Huntington Avenue. Sophie was a bright and responsible student, described by friends as very careful about her safety. She would rarely even date, let alone invite strangers into her home. Yet somehow, on that winter day, she had opened her door to her killer. Sophie was found nude, having been sexually assaulted and strangled with her own nylon stockings. In a departure from the earlier cases, forensic examiners recovered semen at the scene, the first time any physical evidence of the rapist was found. The presence of this clue suggested the killer had either become more careless or more brazen. One of Sophie's neighbors told police that shortly before the murder, a man had knocked on her door claiming he was there to paint the apartment. She turned him away when he became insistent, especially since she pretended her husband was sleeping in the next room. The description she gave, a man dressed like a maintenance worker or handyman, recalled the mysterious green man who had been sexually assaulting women around New England. It was a crucial clue, but at the time, investigators did not yet connect the dots that the Boston Strangler and the Green Man could be one and the same person. Sophie Clark's murder shattered any notion that only certain types of women were in danger. The Strangler had proven he could kill not only elderly maternal figures, but young, vigilant women as well. The city was aghast. If even a careful 21-year-old student could fall victim, who wasn't at risk? Boston's female residents, regardless of age or background, felt a chill of terror. Before the shock of Sophie's death had even faded, the Strangler claimed another life. On December 31st, 1962, just hours before the new year, 23-year-old Patricia Bissett failed to show up for work. Alarmed, her employer went to her apartment near Beacon Hill and made a grim discovery. Patricia was dead in her bed, covered neatly by bed sheets. She was young, engaged to be married, and even pregnant. A hopeful new chapter in her life brutally cut short. Like the others, Patricia had been raped and strangled with her own hosiery. The medical examiner determined she died by ligature strangulation, just like Sophie. There were no signs of forced entry. Despite the tidy appearance of the body under the sheets, it was clear a violent struggle had taken place. The sheer range of victims baffled law enforcement and criminologists. Serial killers were often thought to stick to a certain victim type, but this predator defied that assumption. By early 1963, the Boston Strangler had claimed at least 8 lives. The police were scrambling desperately to find connections between the women. Did they share any acquaintances? Did they frequent the same shops? Did they ever cross paths with the same deliverymen or servicemen? Nothing concrete emerged. Every known sexual offender in the Boston area was interrogated and investigated, yet still nothing turned up. The pressure on the authorities was immense, not least because of the media spotlight. The public's faith in the police was beginning to fray. People locked their doors, not just against the killer, but in some cases against any man they encountered, not knowing whom to trust. For several months after Patricia Bizet's New Year's Eve murder, it seemed the killer had once again gone to ground. Yet, it would not be long before the murderer resumed his grim work. In March 1963, nearly a year after the initial killings began, the Strangler struck outside the immediate Boston City area for the first time. The victim was 68-year-old Mary Brown, found raped and strangled in Lawrence, a city about 25 miles north of Boston. This expanded the geographical scope of the threat and confounded investigators. Was the killer moving beyond Boston, or could this be a copycat? The similarities in the way Mary Brown was killed suggested it was the same man. If so, he was mobile and not tied to a single city. Then, in May 1963, the 10th known victim was discovered, marking one of the most violent episodes of the Strangler's spree. Beverly Sammons was a 23-year-old graduate student and talented singer who lived in the Boston area. She missed a scheduled choir practice on May 8, 1963. Friends who checked on her that evening found Beverly dead in her apartment, a scene of frenzied bloodshed. Beverly had been bound with one of her own scarves, her hands tied behind her back. A nylon stocking and 2 handkerchiefs were knotted tightly around her throat. However, unlike the other victims, strangulation was not the cause of death. Beverly had been repeatedly stabbed. 4 deep stab wounds to her neck appeared to have killed her when the ligature failed to do so. In total, Beverly suffered 22 stab wounds, including a macabre pattern of 18 punctures arranged in a bullseye shape on her right breast. It was an utterly gruesome display of overkill. Investigators theorized that because Beverly was physically strong, perhaps due in part to her vocal training, the killer became enraged when strangulation took too long, resorting to the knife in frustration. Notably, although Beverly was clearly sexually violated as she was found nude, no semen was recovered at this scene, suggesting the killer may have been interrupted or unable to complete the act as he had in previous cases. The sheer brutality of the Sammons murder confirmed that the killer was growing more brazen and violent, further terrifying the public. A murderer who could even change his methods on a whim. Boston's press and populace now understood that they were dealing with a psychopath whose depravity knew no bounds. By late summer 1963, more than a year had passed since the nightmare began, and still, the Boston Strangler roamed free. On September 8, 1963, the terror resurfaced after a quiet few months. In Salem, a historic city north of Boston, 58-year-old Evelyn Corbin was found slain in her home. Evelyn, who was youthful looking for her age and recently divorced, was discovered lying on her bed, nude. Her underwear had been stuffed into her mouth, and traces of semen were found on the undergarment and on her lips. The apartment had been rifled through, but the pattern of valuables left behind persisted. Once again, it seemed a burglary that was staged only to mislead. The killer's true motive was far more depraved. The next victim was not far behind. On November 25, 1963, in the Lawrence section of the city, 23-year-old Joanne Graff was found raped and strangled in her apartment. She was an industrial designer who lived alone. Neighbors reported seeing a stranger around the building prior to her murder. The descriptions they gave sounded eerily familiar. A man, of average height and build, with dark hair, wearing dark green work clothes. This matched closely with the description given by Sophie Clark's neighbor of the painter, as well as aligning with accounts of the elusive Green Man. In retrospect, these eyewitness sightings were the closest anyone came to seeing the Strangler in action. But in 1963, without modern forensic techniques or centralized databases, the connection between the rapist and the killer remained speculative. The murder spree appeared to culminate in the most gruesome crime of all, the killing of Mary Sullivan, a 19-year-old who had just moved to Boston to start a new job. On January 4, 1964, Mary's two roommates returned to their shared apartment on Charles Street in the Beacon Hill area after a short New Year's trip. They walked into a scene of horror that would haunt them forever. Mary was propped up against her bed's headboard, a dark nylon stocking knotted around her neck in the Strangler's signature bow. She had been strangled to death. Even more appalling, a broom handle had been used to sexually assault her, an act of unspeakable cruelty. At Mary's feet, the killer had left a final taunt, a greeting card that read Happy New Year, wedged between her feet, as if congratulating himself on the atrocity he had just committed. The apartment had been thoroughly tossed, clothes and belongings strewn about, yet as with the others, the scene felt oddly performative, a ransack without real purpose. Mary Sullivan, only 19 and full of life, became the last known victim of the Boston Strangler. In just over 18 months, at least 11 women, possibly 13, had been slain by this unseen monster. The city of Boston was at a breaking point. The governor of Massachusetts pressed for action. Massachusetts Attorney General Edward Brooke, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the state, announced in January 1964 that he would take charge of the investigation personally. Brooke assembled a special task force to coordinate the fragmented police efforts, which had involved multiple jurisdictions and thousands of leads. His team had to sift through mountains of reports and tip-offs, looking for the one clue or pattern that might break the case. They revisited crime scene evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and explored every theory from the plausible to the far-fetched. The best psychological profile they could develop suggested the killer would be a man around 30 years old, someone who was orderly or methodical, despite the apparent chaos of the crime scenes, likely someone who worked with his hands in a maintenance-type job, and possibly a loner who might be divorced or separated. It was an educated guess, and actually it was not far off the mark. Yet, despite the task force's renewed vigor, no suspect in the Strangler case was arrested or charged at the time. The string of murders had stopped after Mary Sullivan's death, leaving an entire city wondering if the killer had died, been locked up on unrelated charges, or maybe just decided to disappear. Little did anyone know the Boston Strangler's identity would soon emerge from an entirely unexpected direction. By late 1964, the Boston Strangler investigation was growing cold, but a seemingly unrelated crime spree was about to provide the break that eluded detectives. While the murders had ceased after January 1964, the wave of sexual assaults by the so-called Green Man had not. Women throughout eastern Massachusetts and beyond continued to report terrifying home invasions. A man posing as a handyman, delivery man, or some kind of official would talk his way into an apartment, tie the woman up, and sexually assault her at knife point. In some cases, he robbed them. In others, he fled after the assault, leaving the victims traumatized but alive. These attacks did not result in murder, which is partly why police did not immediately link them to the Strangler case. But the description of the assailant, a polite, dark-haired man in work clothes, was consistent across incidents, and police in multiple communities were on the lookout. The breakthrough came in late October 1964. A young woman in Cambridge survived a horrifying assault in her home. A man had entered posing as a detective, then pulled a knife and tied her to the bed before molesting her. After he fled, this brave victim went straight to the police and gave a detailed description of her attacker. Using that information, Boston area law enforcement quickly identified a suspect, 33-year-old Albert DeSalvo. His face was familiar to some officers from his previous arrest as the Measuring Man. Authorities quietly circulated DeSalvo's photograph in newspapers and to victims of recent assaults, asking if anyone recognized him. The response was overwhelming. Multiple women came forward to positively identify Albert DeSalvo as the man who had attacked them. On November 3, 1964, Albert DeSalvo was arrested on sexual assault and burglary charges, at that point unrelated to the Boston Strangler homicides. Once in custody, DeSalvo confessed to dozens of rapes and break-ins, astonishing investigators with the sheer volume of his admissions. He seemed almost proud of his ability to slip in and out of homes at will. Yet at that time, he said nothing about the Boston Strangler murders. DeSalvo was not initially seen as a suspect in those. After all, he didn't look like a monster, some officers thought. He was of average build, neatly dressed, with a friendly face and manner. He was married, with kids, not the stereotypical lone madman. Still, the similarities in how he gained access to victims by charming or smooth-talking his way in, and the fact that he operated in the same time frame and neighborhoods as the Strangler, gave a few investigators cause to wonder. DeSalvo's arrest meant he would face trial for the string of sex crimes. Because of the heinous violence involved in those assaults, he was sent for a psychiatric evaluation at Bridgewater State Hospital, a secure facility for the criminally insane, while awaiting trial. It was here, in the controlled environment of a mental hospital, that Albert DeSalvo cemented his association with the Boston Strangler case. At Bridgewater State Hospital in 1965, Albert DeSalvo began talking. Whether motivated by guilt or some ulterior plan, DeSalvo started to tell another inmate shocking details about the Boston Strangler murders. That fellow inmate was George Nassar, a convicted murderer known for his intelligence and manipulative skills. According to later accounts, DeSalvo and Nassar struck up an unusual friendship behind bars. The authorities had offered a large reward for information leading to the Strangler's identity. DeSalvo had a family he wanted to support. Together, Nassar and DeSalvo allegedly cooked up a scheme. DeSalvo would confess to being the Boston Strangler, and Nassar would help him, and perhaps feed him details, so that they could claim reward money and profit from book or movie deals about the case. DeSalvo knew he was likely facing a long prison term for the Green Man assaults regardless, so he figured he had little to lose. If he could parlay a murder confession into an insanity plea, he might avoid a harsh prison sentence. Instead, spending his life in a mental institution and ensuring his wife and children received some financial support from his notoriety. It was a risky gambit, but DeSalvo moved forward. He managed to secure a meeting with a prominent attorney, not just any lawyer, but F. Lee Bailey, a rising star in the legal world. Bailey would later become famous as part of O.J. Simpson's defense team decades afterwards. Bailey was appointed to represent DeSalvo in the sexual assault cases, but soon found himself fielding a far more explosive issue. His client claimed to be the Boston Strangler. Initially, even DeSalvo's own wife refused to believe it, saying he must be fabricating the confession for money or attention. To assess the truth, Bailey arranged a series of intensive interviews with DeSalvo, with detectives present. Over many hours, DeSalvo began to describe each of the 13 murders attributed to the Strangler, one by one, in chilling detail. Bailey was stunned by what he heard. DeSalvo knew things that had never been made public: the layout of the victims' apartments, the clothes the women had been wearing, the positions of their bodies, the particular knots used to tie the ligatures. He spoke of Anna Slessor's blue housecoat cord and how her son's arrival had interrupted his work. Juris Slessor's knocking on the door actually caused DeSalvo to flee the scene, which is why the son initially mistook the scene for a suicide. He recalled the bizarre situation of Mary Mullen collapsing from a heart attack before he could even lay a hand on her. A wasted opportunity, he reportedly called it, showing a disturbing lack of remorse. In the case of 75-year-old Ida Erga, F. Lee Bailey later recounted how DeSalvo coolly explained that he picked an elderly victim at random. When asked why he would choose a woman of that age, DeSalvo replied, "Attractiveness had nothing to do with it," implying it was the act of killing itself that he craved, not some twisted sexual attraction. One particularly eerie story DeSalvo told was of an attack that hadn't been publicly linked to the Strangler before. He described assaulting a young woman from Denmark who was living in Boston. As he wrapped his hands around her throat, he caught a glimpse of himself in a mirror, seeing the face of a killer. For a moment, something in him balked. Horrified by what he was doing, he released the girl. He actually apologized to this victim and begged her not to tell the police before he fled. Indeed, the young Danish woman had reported a near strangulation to Boston police, a rare survivor of the Strangler's wrath. Her account had been logged, but with few leads to pursue until DeSalvo's confession corroborated her evidence. After many hours of interrogation, both Attorney Bailey and the detectives were convinced that Albert DeSalvo was indeed the Boston Strangler. They had no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no blood, no eyewitnesses, but they had something arguably more compelling: the killer's own words coming from DeSalvo's mouth. In a controlled environment, without having seen the crime scenes since the murders, DeSalvo produced detail after detail that only the perpetrator would know. It was as if a dam had broken inside him. Perhaps he found a perverse relief in finally owning up to the atrocities. Perhaps he relished the attention that the confession might bring. Perhaps it was both. Despite the confession, there was a huge obstacle, because there was no hard evidence independently linking DeSalvo to the murders. The district attorney's office felt they could not risk putting him on trial for them. If they did, and he was somehow acquitted due to insanity or lack of proof, double jeopardy would prevent ever trying him again should evidence surface later. On top of that, all they really had was DeSalvo's own admission, which isn't enough for a murder conviction without corroboration. So, in a strange twist, Albert DeSalvo was never formally charged or tried for the Boston Strangler murders. Instead, authorities proceeded with the ironclad cases they had against him: the Green Man sexual assaults and related felonies. In January 1967, Albert DeSalvo went on trial for numerous counts of sexual assault, robbery, and burglary related to his Green Man crime spree. F. Lee Bailey attempted an insanity defense, using DeSalvo's claims of being the Strangler as part of his argument, essentially asserting that no sane person could have committed such ghastly crimes. Therefore, DeSalvo must have been insane. The strategy was risky and ultimately unsuccessful. The jury found DeSalvo guilty of the sexual assaults. Given the horrific violence and the number of victims involved in those cases alone, the judge imposed a life sentence in 1967. DeSalvo was sent to Walpole State Prison, Massachusetts' maximum security penitentiary, to begin serving his term. At Walpole, DeSalvo was not a popular prisoner. Officially, he was there for rape and sexual offenses, but everyone knew he was the alleged Boston Strangler. It had been front-page news. In the unwritten code of prison life, those who harm women or the vulnerable are often targeted by other inmates. DeSalvo's notoriety made him both a celebrity of sorts and a marked man in the prison population. He did not fade quietly into anonymity behind bars. Incarceration seemed to rekindle DeSalvo's need for attention. He cooperated extensively with author Gerald Frank, who wrote a best-selling book in 1966 titled The Boston Strangler. He based it on hundreds of hours of interviews with DeSalvo and those involved in the case. DeSalvo reveled in describing his version of events to Frank and others, though he reportedly later recanted his confession, alternately claiming innocence or hazy memory of certain murders depending on when he was asked. Within Walpole's walls, DeSalvo continued to exhibit erratic behavior that some saw as evidence of mental illness and others saw as pure manipulation. At times, he bragged about his infamous deeds. At other times, he claimed he didn't remember or that he had made it all up. The truth, as so often in this case, was hard to pin down with Albert DeSalvo. In the early hours of November 25, 1973, Albert DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in his cell at Walpole State Prison. He had been attacked with a shiv, a makeshift prison knife, suffering multiple stab wounds to the heart. The murder of one of the most notorious inmates in Massachusetts sent shockwaves through the prison system and made headlines across the nation. Who would kill Albert DeSalvo, and why? The circumstances of the killing were suspicious from the start. DeSalvo was being held in a medium security block at Walpole, and the area was supposed to be tightly monitored. Yet somehow his killer or killers gained access to his cell in the middle of the night and carried out the murder without any guards interfering. The level of security in that unit suggested that the attack was not a spontaneous scuffle, but a planned hit that may have involved cooperation from prison staff, or at least a blind eye turned by someone on the inside. DeSalvo, who was 42 at the time, had reportedly gotten involved in a prison drug trafficking ring. One theory holds that he was killed for crossing the wrong people in an illicit enterprise. Another theory, more tantalizing to the public imagination, was that he was silenced to prevent whatever revelation he was about to make regarding the Boston Strangler case. After all, he had just told a doctor that he urgently needed to share new information about the Strangler murders, and that meeting was to happen the very morning he was found dead. Could it be that DeSalvo was preparing to confess that he wasn't actually the killer for all of the murders, or to implicate someone else, perhaps George Nassar, in some of the crimes? Those questions died with him, and they have fueled conspiracy theories ever since. No one was ever charged with DeSalvo's homicide. So many chapters of the Boston Strangler saga, the truth remained frustratingly elusive. DeSalvo's death meant that for many, a kind of brutal justice had been served. He would never walk free again, and he paid for both his convicted and alleged crimes with his life, though at the hands of a fellow prisoner rather than the state. But this stabbing also meant that any further clarifications or admissions he might have been about to offer about the murders were lost forever. Though, in truth, new information from him would have had questionable value. One thing he had definitely proven is that he was an unreliable source. Officially, the Boston Strangler case remained open, though no similar murders occurred after DeSalvo was locked up. Prosecutors had never been able to close the file in court since DeSalvo was never convicted of the murders. It seems that the final hope of conclusively resolving the case might have died with Albert DeSalvo. Even as Albert DeSalvo went to his grave, many people still doubted that he was truly responsible for all the Boston Strangler murders. Some who knew him could not reconcile the mild-mannered family man they remembered with the sadistic killer described in the case files. Investigators themselves were split on the truth of DeSalvo's claims. There were aspects of his confession that didn't line up perfectly with the known evidence. In his initial recounting, DeSalvo made errors about certain details, errors that skeptics argue someone who actually committed the crimes would not have made. It's possible, they suggest, that DeSalvo learned about some of the crime scene specifics from police or press reports and filled in the rest with his imagination. It did not help that in a few of the murders, witnesses reported seeing a suspect who looked somewhat different from DeSalvo's appearance. At least one woman survived an encounter that might have been at the Strangler's hands, and she did not identify DeSalvo as her attacker. In fact, when police brought the Stranglers' one surviving victim, Gertrude Gruen, to secretly observe DeSalvo at Bridgewater State Hospital, she shook her head and said he was not the man who had tried to strangle her. But when she saw another prisoner, George Nassar, walking by, she became extremely upset, saying that his presence felt frighteningly familiar. This fueled speculation that perhaps Nasser, or someone else entirely, was the culprit in at least some of the murders. The obvious lack of a consistent pattern among the victims, who varied widely in age, appearance, and background, led some experts to propose that the Boston Strangler wasn't a single person after all, but rather a convenient label for what might have been the work of multiple killers operating in the same city. Author Susan Kelly's 1995 book, The Boston Stranglers, argued exactly this: that there were likely several murderers, and that DeSalvo's confession was a self-serving fabrication that officials were all too eager to accept to close the case. The fact that DeSalvo was never tried meant that the question was left to the court of public opinion and the minds of armchair detectives for decades. For a long time, the truth remained uncertain. The families of the victims, as well as DeSalvo's own family, struggled with the ambiguity. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic science offered a new avenue for answers. Some of the physical evidence from the 1960s crime scenes had been preserved, including biological samples from the rape and murder of Mary Sullivan, the Strangler's final victim. In 2001, DeSalvo's body was exhumed so that DNA could be extracted from his remains, and that profile was compared to the semen evidence from Mary Sullivan's case. At the time, the results were inconclusive. They did not find a match. This surprising outcome bolstered the doubters' case. Maybe DeSalvo really wasn't Mary's killer, and by extension, not the Strangler. Or maybe the lab work just wasn't advanced enough yet. Law enforcement and the victims' families pushed for more definitive answers as technology improved. A major breakthrough finally came in 2013, nearly 50 years after the last Boston Strangler murder. By then, DNA testing had become far more sensitive and advanced. Boston police scientists were able to develop a refined DNA profile from evidence preserved in Mary Sullivan's murder. First, they detected a familial DNA match using a DNA sample from one of DeSalvo's living relatives, indicating that whoever left the semen at the scene was almost certainly a male member of DeSalvo's family. On that basis, a court authorized the exhumation of Albert DeSalvo's remains once again. This time, the testing was conclusive. In July 2013, Massachusetts authorities announced that DNA from DeSalvo's exhumed body matched the semen found on Mary Sullivan's body with essentially 100% certainty. The odds that the DNA belonged to someone else were on the order of 1 in 220 billion, effectively zero. This leaves no doubt that Albert DeSalvo was responsible for the brutal murder of Mary Sullivan, declared Martha Coakley, the state attorney general, adding that it was most likely that he was the Boston Strangler responsible for the other victims as well. For Mary Sullivan's family, the DNA evidence provided a long-awaited sense of closure. Mary's nephew, Casey Sherman, who had once joined the DeSalvo family in questioning DeSalvo's guilt, publicly stated that the DNA match finally gave his family peace in knowing who killed Mary. However, even Sherman acknowledged that some mysteries around the Boston Strangler case would likely linger forever. After all, the DNA only tied DeSalvo conclusively to the last victim. For the earlier murders, no usable DNA or forensic evidence survives. Those cases occurred in an era when such evidence was often not collected or properly preserved. Thus, while the Mary Sullivan DNA match strongly indicates DeSalvo's involvement in the other killings, the debate over whether he truly committed all the Strangler murders or whether some might have been the work of a copycat cannot be entirely put to rest. Thanks for joining me for this week's story. I wonder what new scientific breakthroughs are yet to come that will be able to bring closure to cold cases from today. Let me know in the comments if you've heard of any exciting new developments in forensics. Remember to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel, and I'll see you next time for another unusual, unsettling, and maybe unsolved story on Fridays with Tony.